Hello, everybody. This is the video for Chapter 14, Early Adulthood. But now we're going to talk about social and emotional development. Okay. I'm going to begin by talking about separation. Separation is the idea that when we enter early adulthood, one of the things we have to be able to do is to separate from our childhood home, our connection with our parents, and to start to individuate, that is, learn to become our own person, our own version of an adult. Um, there are a few different theories that describe this. Some of them we've already talked about. A lot of separation has to do with what our culture expects us to do. So Havinghurst talks about tasks that we must complete in order to truly separate. Becoming, having an occupation, getting a job, finding a mate, learning to live codependently with our partner, developing a family, assuming the responsibilities of managing a home, assuming civic responsibilities, and then finding a congenial social group, that is, connecting not just with our family, but also within our community, and usually making good, strong connections within them. Uh, these things are related to the culture that you live in. So a lot of separation and individuation is very cultural. And one of the things that I'm going to hit on is the idea that some of these older theories, Havinghurst here, his books were occurred in 1972, and some of the theories don't always bear out for us living so many years later. And I'm going to continuously point that out, that some of these theories made more sense in a culture that existed a few generations ago. And although they're still very similar, because we're still, we still grow old, we still have to separate and become individuals, you'll notice that some of these ideas are not always perfectly aligned to us and our culture. Now, obviously, with that in mind, young adults leave home at different ages and for different reasons. And again, culture plays an important aspect of that. There used to be a time when before you were 18, people already thought of you as an adult, and there was a push to, that adult to leave the home and make their own life. And yet there are cultures where uh, young people live at home for a long time until they get married. They don't really leave the roost. In our culture, it's very variable, right? Some people leave really early, they get married early on. Some people leave really late. They go to college, they sort of wait until they get married. And in modern times, there is a lot of leaving and coming back, and I'll hit on that a little bit later. Uh, there's a lot of young people live at home to save money. Um, Others might go to college or join the military, and so when people leave and how people leave their home completely depends on the culture and the society that you live in. Um, my culture is, my generation, millennials, is often called the Boomerang Generation. Although most of you guys, Generation Z individuals, are probably going to live a very similar aspect of this Boomerang Generation. That is, you become an adult, you leave for a while, but then you come back. So you might leave and go live with a roommate, or you might go to college or the military, and then you come back to live at home. So it's like a boomerang that you throw out, parents throw out, but then it returns. Um, again, this is directly related to our culture. We do not live in a society where someone who's 18, 20, even 25 or 30 can live on their own. It's too expensive in most of the country, and there are a lot of barriers. So even people who are who are individuating correctly, who are separating correctly, society doesn't really allow for that complete separation. And so there's always a return home because parents tend to be more stable. And so they're able to do that. In some cases, some people leave and come back with a partner. And so they leave alone and they come back with a wife and kids or a husband and kids to live at home with mom and dad because our culture, our society is still not dealing well with, a, a brand new person who does not have a lot of experience, who can't find a good job. It's hard to just sort of make it on your own. When we talk about this, about individuation, one of the key things that we're trying to do is to sort of develop your own sense of values, right? You're kind of leaving your parents behind and trying to figure out who you are as a person, what things matter to you, what things don't. Um, Identity plays an important role. And then, of course, being able to break the connection of your parents. Um, Individuation seems to be, or at least in older theories, like I mentioned, older times, um, it used to be something that was more important to men. Uh, Men often consider individuation an important or a key goal. And when the parents can't let go, men struggle a lot more to get free from sort of their parents' control. In modern time, women probably do a lot of this as well, but it's important to point out that at least in the past, women seem to want to maintain social relationships a lot more, and that's probably still true today. Women are still way more feminine than men. Remember, the femininity has to do with building emotional connections, being able to sort of relate to others. Women do that much better than men, um, in our culture still. And so those connections to our parents are still very important to the average woman, but also to the average woman in our society. Uh, Women are more masculine than they used to be by a lot. And so women do care about their individuality today. Women do care about finding a job and being an independent person and who am I as a person and how am I going to fit into this world. Women care about those things today as well. And so in some ways, the theory still works pretty well, but in some ways, our society has grown beyond parts of it. Now, we already talked about Erikson's stages. We talked about trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shim and Tao, industry versus inferiority. We talked about intimacy, identity versus role confusion. And now in early adulthood, we're talking about intimacy versus isolation. What is happening is that adults or young adults are trying to find a partner. And what a partner is, again, matters uh, in the context of society. It used to be the case that if you were a woman, what you were looking for was a man who could, support your family, bring home the bacon. And women weren't really looking for someone to share their daily life with, go to the mall with them or talk about their dreams and their future. And so if you were a woman who only wanted a man to support her and your husband did that well, even if he wasn't very good at all the social stuff, that person, you and that person would be able to be intimate. And the same thing for men. Men a long time ago were looking for a woman who would take care of the home and the kids, and they weren't really interested in someone who could, you know, they could talk to about their day necessarily, or uh, they could watch a sports game with. And so in the past, if a man met a woman who could not really share emotionally with him, but uh, was able to fulfill those other cultural needs, he felt a sense of intimacy with her, a sense of, you and me, we're in this together. Okay. And the same thing for that woman. Today, those things, right, those concepts are gone. The idea that a man is going to bring home the bacon and a woman is going to take care of the kids in the house are almost silly. And so if you're looking for a partner, very few of us are looking for a partner who's just going to like take care of the home, or who's just going to like bring home the bacon. We tend to look for someone who's going to share emotionally with us, who we can feel cares about us, and they show that by, you know, talking to us, being there for us in our time of need, that we can share with. And so uh, that is what develops intimacy today. And so that's what people are looking for during this stage, is intimacy, a closeness with the person, the romantic relationship that you're developing. Um, just because you have a romantic relationship does not mean that you have intimacy. And in fact, you're going to meet a lot of people in your life, hopefully not you, but that does happen to a lot of people. They're in a relationship with someone, but that is not someone that they feel intimate with. They have sex with them, they have a romantic relationship, but they don't share their life with them. They don't feel like, you and me, we're in this together, we're going to get through this together. And so instead, what they develop is a sense of isolation, that even though they're with someone, they feel alone. Um, Now, a lot of times people don't develop intimacy because they're not really ready to commit to a relationship. And this might have to do with the previous stage. I'm going to go back here a little bit. So when you are a young adult, you're hearing intimacy versus isolation. But when you were a teenager, in adolescence, you were developing identity versus role confusion. And a lot of times, people who develop role confusion have a hard time developing intimacy. So these two stages are somewhat connected. Um, when a person does not develop a good sense of identity, that often means that their sense of intimacy might be distorted in the future. And obviously, isolation can lead to feelings of loneliness, even though they may have a relationship that they are a part of. Okay. Another important cultural change that has occurred over the years is the age difference. When Erikson was talking about uh, intimacy versus isolation, he was talking about young people, people that today, you guys, uh, who were 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, were starting to have relationships, getting married, and then starting a family. Today, that doesn't happen as often. The average man today gets married for the first time at around 29.8 years old. And the women today get married for the first time on average at 27.8. So there is a big difference. Now, of course, there are people who still get married very young or sometimes older, but on average, we just have a much older age of first time marriage than when Erikson was first doing his research. Again, this is because in our culture, people tend to wait longer. They might be going to college, they might be trying to find themselves before they decide, oh, I want to have a family and I'm ready now to start a family. And so all of these cultural aspects completely affect our crises and our development into early adulthood. Another theory of how we shift throughout adulthood has to do, excuse me, we call it seasons of life. Daniel Levinson's seasons of life are stages that we go through in our early adulthood and middle adulthood, late adulthood life that sort of structure how we develop or how we see ourselves. Now, Levinson uh, talks about two types of seasons: stable periods and transitional periods. And so there are stable periods where we are kind of getting used to our lives and trying, to sort of live our lives and kind of enjoying them. And then there are transitional periods where um, we have to sort of rethink who we are. We start to wonder, do I fit into this world? Is this the kind of person I want to be? Uh, and we this during these stages that we kind of build a roadmap. This is how I want my life to be, and then during those stable periods, then we try to achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves. Um, Now, basically, what we're developing during those transitions is a life structure, this pattern of what a life should be like. These are going to include things like relationships and career, but of course, who we are, our race, our religion, our economic status, our culture is going to help define those or that life structure. Now, during uh, early adulthood, especially in your 20s, um, you're in a stage where uh, you're developing your dream. This is one of those seasons of life that Levinson talks about. And the dream is kind of this feeling that you want to leave a mark on the world. A lot of times when you are uh, in your 20s, you still have this sort of vision of like, I'm going to do something great and it's going to be important. And you kind of see yourself as sort of not just enjoying a normal human life, but doing something spectacular. And so that begins that blueprint of who you're going to be as an adult. And that's going to change because, first of all, yeah, some people do amazing things that leave their mark on the planet, but most of us are just trying to live our lives and enjoy it and do well enough for our families, etc. And so what's going to happen is eventually you're going to, excuse me, uh, from that dream period where you're sort of forming an occupation and relationships, you're going to shift out of that into your age 30, which includes a transition period um, and a stable period. And again, imagine you're in your 20s, you have these big dreams about who you're going to be, you're going to put that plan into motion, and then one day you wake up when you're 30 and you realize, oh, is this still who I want to be? Is this stuff still something that I care about? And you have to reassess who you are as a person in that transition period, and then uh, go back into a settling down period where now you're trying to build a life that is usually more sustainable, more realistic, um, but it's still important, right? To you is a you're building a life that is going to usually or hopefully help you become a someone who is satisfied with their life. Again, later on in your 40s and 50s, you're again going to go into a transition period and a stable period again, where again in your 40s, late 40s, you're going to have introspection. Who am I? Can I make my life more meaningful? And then entering that stable period where you try to put that into action. Now, one of the biggest issues, again, from the modern perspective, is that some of Levingson's views are outdated. Again, um, Levinson didn't see women as wanting independence and, caring a lot about occupational goals, who they wanted to be in a professional setting. Levinson was saw women as caring about their social life and their social relationships. And he saw men as being having the desire to be independent and to develop career goals, etc. Obviously, today we understand that those were just social constructs, and once we kind of did away as a society with those social constructs of gender, women now obviously care about who they're going to be professionally, and they want independence, etc. Slowly, men are also trying to develop social and emotional bonds, and those things matter. Am I going to be a father? How good of a husband am I going to be? How important is it for me to still be a good son or a good brother, etc., a good friend? Because um, uh, feminism has sort of pushed women to be more independent faster than pushed men to want to be more social and emotional. Well, we see have this weird disconnect where women are way more independent than men are social and emotional, but those things are coming, and slowly we will see that change occur throughout the entire culture. All right, let's talk a little bit about love and attraction, because obviously one of the important goals and events that happens in early adulthood, we already said, is making that emotional connection. And that emotional connection, that romantic connection, is usually about sexual attraction and love. Now, um, in developed nations like ours, the Western world, young adults are kind of free to choose who they want to develop an emotional attachment with. And although most people don't like to admit it, physical appearance is an important part of that. You are sexually attracted to some people, and you are not sexually attracted to others. Um, Obviously, we in our culture, in most cultures, uh, your romantic relationship is directly related to your sexual attraction to that person. Now, in some cultures where, let's say, your parents choose uh, your mate, your romantic partner, sometimes you don't really have a choice in that. In some cultures, especially for women, uh, the financial stability of the man is more important than how visually appealing that man might be. When people are allowed to choose, women tend to choose men who are much taller than them and men who are financially stable and can financially support them. In countries like ours, where women have the ability to be financially independent, um, how how much money a man makes is less important, but it's not completely out of the equation. Quite likely because our society still kind of functions this way, and women are internalized this feeling that if a man makes less money than them, then that man is probably not good enough or something like that. But certainly, women who are independent care less about that than women who are not independent. Obviously, if you need someone, your partner, to make enough money to support you, then that becomes really important, and it's something that you look for. For men, almost in every culture, physical appearance is super important. Men tend to prefer women who look younger and who have a specific waist to thigh and breast ratio. Sometimes we call that the hourglass figure. Um, in any case, in most cultures, we find that men really react to that. Now, obviously, there are non-physical traits that are important for attraction. Smiling faces attract more attention. And then there's weird things that are kind of social, maybe even evolutionary. So if a woman is very beautiful, if a man considers that a woman is very beautiful and she smiles at him, he's going to find her more attractive than if she doesn't. But if a man considers a woman to be sort of middle of the road or not super attractive, then he will find her more attractive if she ignores him. And so that's just a weird thing that happens. Is it social? Is it evolutionary? There's not really a good answer for that, but it is something that does occur. How much attention the woman gives the man is going to affect how much he finds her attractive. And of course, uh, different levels of beauty seem to play a role in that. Obviously, there are gender role expectations as well. Women tend to be attracted to socially dominant men. Um, uh, and men are not always attracted to socially dominant women. And in fact, under certain circumstances, especially if a man is not very secure in his own dominance and his own masculinity or strength, he might actually find a dominant women less attractive. And that could be a problem in a relationship. Um, the majority of women think that it's important for a man to have a steady job, where, again, men don't always care about that. Now, one of the things that we find is really well correlated to um, attraction is what we call the attraction similarity hypothesis. That is, you tend to find people who are the most like you attractive. That includes uh, social traits and uh, level of socioeconomic background, um, but it also includes beauty standards. So uh, people who are very beautiful tend to find other very beautiful people attractive. Um, and people who are middle of the road tend to find people who are middle of the road attractive, etc. This is this occurs a little bit more with men than with women. So what we find is that if a guy is very attractive, he often has men friends or male friends who are equally as attractive as he is. Um, Whereas women will have friends that are a little bit more variable in the in the level of beauty. But again, we tend to be attracted to people who are similar to us. We also tend to be attracted to people who are nice to us. If uh, if someone thinks you're beautiful, if someone thinks you're smart, you tend to think that that person's got it right. And so you're more likely to like that person. Let's talk a little bit about love and romantic love. First of all, romantic love is a completely cultural idea that isn't even that old, really, from our perspective. No one in the 1400s and or before that would have thought a whole lot about romantic love as being important to a relationship. Relationships in the past used to be about social contracts, right? This family is well off and you want to marry into that well off family. So who cares if you don't like this person? That's going to help the family and it's going to help you out, etc. And so a lot of times relationships were created by the parents. When romantic love first started to develop as a philosophical or social aspect, it was thought about not as the people who you are going to marry or the person you're going to marry. It was kind of people you uh, fell in love with in a almost celebrity kind of way. You know, other people in other parts of the world that you had read about. And sometimes people would write long love letters, flattering their love, the romantic love interest. They were not trying to develop a sexual relationship or a marriage. It was almost philosophical. Um, but slowly, uh, in the Western world, the idea that you're going to marry someone that you love takes hold. And there was at least one portion of time where parents were very upset with their kids. Their kids weren't marrying the the person that the parent had chosen, but instead they wanted to marry the person they loved, and it was uh, kind of a weird time in the Western world. Um, Today, we tend to always think that. We tend to think that you always marry the person that you love. Um, and almost every aspect of our culture tells you that, from fairy tales to movies to TV shows, to just when people talk about their relationships, even bad relationships, people often talk about them in that context, the context of I married the person I loved. Now, one of the aspects of this idea of love and romantic love is that we respond to the physiological reaction of sexual attraction as if though it were a signal that you love that person. And so you see someone who is beautiful and your body just reacts, right? The same way that your body reacts when you touch a hot stove, or when you taste delicious tasting food, your body just reacts. There's muscle tension, maybe your heart speeds up or slows down. The hormones are released, and your brain, you go, oh, why am I feeling this way? Oh, I must be feeling this way because I'm in love, because I love this person. And because throughout your entire life, you've been told that loving someone, having this reaction, this physiological reaction to a person means that you love them, well, then you tend to think, oh, then this must mean that this is the person that I'm going to spend the rest of my life with. That is not always the case. In fact, it's probably most of the time not the case. Um, you can have an emotional reaction, a physiological reaction to lots of people. Lots of people are beautiful and lots of people are nice and kind, and a lot of people can make your physiology react. Um, but that doesn't always mean that you can learn to connect and have intimacy and have a commitment to this person. All those things don't occur just because you have a physiological reaction. And yet, that physiological reaction is still an important part of at least romance in our culture. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about Sternberg's triangular theory of love, and I sort of want to break it down. Here you see it all together, and I'm going to kind of break it down a little bit more. There are three variables. Intimacy. Intimacy is how close you can be to someone, how much you like them. Commitment is commitment, how committed you are to this person, and passion includes the sexual attraction and the desire to be sexual with someone. By itself, none of those three variables make love, not the kind of love that can last. Intimacy by itself, intimacy, commitment, passion. Intimacy by itself is really just liking. If you've ever seen shows like Lucifer, uh, he just kind of becomes really intrigued by certain people and he becomes incredibly intimate with them. Sometimes he literally has sex with them, but other times he's just really intrigued by them. He really likes them a lot. But then he gets bored and he moves on. Little kids do this, right? They become really, really close to someone, but that doesn't really last. It's not important to them. Once they move on, they've moved on. Commitment by itself is also not true love. If you've ever seen Married with Children or shows like it, uh, these two individuals, Peg and Al Bundy, they are committed to each other. They never cheat on each other, but they clearly are not intimate. They don't really seem to like each other a whole lot. And there's not even really a lot of passion. They almost avoid sexual contact with each other. And again, passion by itself does not create love. Passion by itself is just a form of infatuation. It's just a sexual attraction. And you can have that sexual attraction with lots of people. You are not even intimate, right? You don't even necessarily like this person. You don't want to get close to them, and you certainly don't want to commit to them. You just have a sexual attraction to them. Now, you can combine any of these three variables, and it also shows a different dimension of love, but it's not always the kind of love that can be part of a relationship. So, for example, if you uh, put intimacy and commitment together, we call that companionate love. And that's going to include sometimes much older couples who are not passionate. They're not really sexual anymore, but they still have a lot of intimacy. They're close and emotional with each other. They talk to each other and they're committed. Companionate love also includes friendships, right? Especially friendships that last over the years. Here you have the same five friends taking the same picture over and over and over again throughout the years, right? A lot of friendships aren't like this. There's a lot of intimacy. You like these people, you share parts of your life with them, and there's a commitment to the relationship. What's missing here is the passion. There isn't a sexual attraction to these people. These guys are just your friends. These people are just your friends. Or in the case of the much older married couple, they've left the passion kind of behind because their bodies are not really reacting to that anymore. And so but they still have the intimacy and the commitment. Now, some relationships have commitment and passion, but they don't have intimacy. And so these people are committed to the relationship and they still sexually attracted to each other, but they don't necessarily have a shared bond anymore. So if you've ever watched The Kids Are Okay, uh, Jules and Nick, they're committed to each other and they have passion for each other. They're still sexually attracted to each other, but there's not a lot of sharing in the emotion anymore. And it's almost part of the end of the story. They're like, oh, is that, like it doesn't really seem like they came together at the end. They're just committed to each other. Um, and again, we call this fatuous love. Let me give a couple more examples here. If you've ever seen Family Guy, uh, Peter and Lois, clearly they still have passion and they're committed to each other, but they don't really connect with each other. They almost live two separate lives. Now, they're just cartoons, but even within the context of the cartoon, they almost lead two different lives that have nothing to do with one another. If you've ever seen Breaking Bad, Walter and Skyler, also, they're kind of living two separate lives. They're still passionate. They're still sexually attracted to each other. They're committed to one another, but they are not sharing. They have no intimacy. Now, also, you could have passion and intimacy. And this is what we call romantic love. If you've seen shows like How I Met Your Mother, um, uh, Ted, um, has a lot of girlfriends, and all of the girlfriends that he seems to be really devoted to them. He's sexually attracted to them. They seem to be very, very close, and it seems like, oh, this is the one. This is definitely the one. But at the end of each show or season, he realizes, oh no, this is not the person I want, because what's missing in romantic love is commitment. And so, although there's a lot of passion and there's a lot of intimacy, there's a lot of that feeling of bonding, there's no commitment. And so, eventually, what ends up happening is one or both of the partners really realizes that they want to leave. Romeo and Juliet also has a lot of passion, or had a lot of passion and intimacy, but they lacked commitment. It's part of the tragedy that towards the end, right? Romeo obviously first was in love with another girl. He quickly, almost on a dime, falls in love with Juliet, and it's very passionate. There's a lot of intimacy, there's a lot of this romantic love, and sure enough, the commitment at the end kind of comes in their deaths, which is kind of why it's a little bit tragic, or a lot tragic, depending on how much you enjoyed it. Um, if you watched Brokeback Mountain, a lot of romantic love there. There was a lot of intimacy between Enid and, I always forget their names, Enos and Jack. Um, uh, they clearly found each other sexually attractive, passion. They were very bonded, intimacy, but there was little to no commitment. They, had other relationships. Enos was married. Jack was married at another point. Jack has another relationship with another man at another point, and yet they still have this romantic relationship that seems so powerful but completely lacks commitment. On the other hand, uh, when you have all three of these variables, then you have what we would call consummate love, which is kind of completed. So whether you're talking about Pam and Jim, or Cameron and Mitchell, or Nomi and Amanita, um, uh, so that's The Office, and uh, Sense8, and I'm sorry, I forgot the name of that show. Um, Modern Family. Sorry. Uh, these are very good uh, representations of consummate love. There's intimacy where they're clearly sharing, parts of their lives, and there's a lot of bonding and caring and talking. There's commitment. They're all committed to one another. Sometimes, that can falter, but yet they always come back because they are committed to each other. And there's passion. They love each other, and they are clearly sexually attracted to each other. So again, we call this the triangular theory of love, because there are these three variables that come together in a lot of different ways, and they can affect the kind of relationship that you have. All right. Once you have a relationship, then there's a good chance that jealousy might become a part of what happens. Partners often become jealous when someone in the relationships shows sexual interest in somebody else outside of the relationship. Jealousy can have both good and bad parts, right? Jealousy sometimes can keep the passion a little bit alive, but even more than just a little bit can become very toxic. And all of a sudden, one of the partners might feel like they own the other, and they start setting limits that are unrealistic about the relationship and how much you can interact with other people, etc. Oftentimes, jealousy does either stem from feelings of insecurity and rejection and mistrust, or it can create those. Unfortunately, some people will play jealousy kind of games. If I want my partner to pay more attention to me, sometimes I might decide that if I make them jealous, they will pay more attention to me. And sometimes that works. But a lot of times that can become incredibly toxic in the relationship, and it will actually hurt the relationship more than help it. And unfortunately, this is something that a lot of people just don't learn, and they continue to sort of fall into these patterns. Not to mention, sometimes because jealousy can kind of stir passion, uh, people often believe that jealousy means that someone loves you more. And that's not always. In fact, it's probably hardly ever true. Jealousy is more about ownership and is about power and is about control. And although it can absolutely stir some passions, uh, the average psychologist is probably going to tell you that it's more toxic than it is helpful in a relationship. And on that same line, loneliness often comes because of relationships from both things. Not having a relationship can create loneliness, and also being in a relationship where there is no intimacy, where you don't feel bonded to the person that you've chosen, that also might create loneliness. Um, Loneliness often might begin in childhood and increases into adolescence. And especially when we feel rejected by our peers, that might increase loneliness. And of course, if we are rejected by our partners, or we don't have a partner, or we have a partner and it breaks apart, that can absolutely create loneliness. Okay. Um, Obviously, stress leads to health problems. And so loneliness can be a part of that as well. The loneliness or the stress of loneliness might lead to health issues. And the opposite is also true. When you feel very connected to others, not just a romantic partner, but if you have family, if you have friends, if you have social connections, that will often lessen stressors. Even bad stressors can often be lessened by social interaction, and that will lead to better health and less issues with obesity and the health, cardiovascular issues. Um, okay. Let's talk about a little bit about being single. Um, First of all, it used to be the case that being single was considered a problem. Um, there was a time where if you were like 19 or 20 years old and you were a woman and you weren't married, people will call you an old maid. Why aren't you married? What is wrong with you? Men, for the most part, have been giving a wider sort of latitude um, to be single. Men have always been expected to sort of be settled before anyone will want to marry them. And so you probably want a job and a house and something to call your own before someone thinks of you as marriage material. And so, because of that, men have always been given a little bit more latitude as to when they get married. Uh, but still, if you were getting older, if you were in your 30s, people would have wondered why you weren't married. Today, it's quite common for people to be unmarried and single. And in your 20s, more than in your 30s or 40s. Although, again, because our culture has changed so much, a lot of people in their 30s are single, or sometimes they'll be, married or have a relationship for a while and then they'll be single again. And it's quite common. We all kind of expect that now, where in the past it would have been kind of unheard of. It would have meant that there was something quote unquote wrong with you. Today we know that that's not true. Um, Now, of course, being single can come with feelings of loneliness, the yearning for a steady relationship. That's quite common, but it's not common for everybody. Some people are happy being single, and some people are just better single than in a relationship. And when they kind of come to grips with that, they just go, yeah, I'm fine. This is the way I want to live. Some people, in fact, internalize that feeling so completely that sometimes they're in a relationship and they're like, no, I don't want to get married, because they've internalized this idea that they're single is the way they want to be, that they don't, even though they're in a good relationship, they kind of just never get ready to participate in a marriage. Unfortunately, also women worry about physical safety, and often being with a man will lessen that. It's a very almost sad reason to be in a marriage, but it is something that a lot of people think about. Again, as I mentioned, in the past, it was considered that people who were single were maladjusted somehow. And today we know that that's not true. Most people who are single are, in fact, well adjusted. They are functional in other parts of their life. They may have friendships, they're good at their job, they might have a happy life. They're just not in a relationship. Um, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Uh, uh, Again, it could be work, it could be a personal choice, etc. Now, also, more and more, people practice what we sometimes call serial monogamy. Now, true monogamy is sort of an idea, I hate to say of the past, but for a lot of people is an idea of the past. True monogamy meant that the first person you had sex with was the last person you had sex with. You were married to one person and just you had one relationship that was sexual your entire life. It is rare for people to be part of a true uh, monogamy kind of lifestyle. Today, more people have a serial monogamy kind of lifestyle where you're committed to the person you're with. And so long as you're in that relationship, you're not cheating on them. Um, but if that relationship falls apart, then you'll just find somebody else to marry or somebody else to have an emotional relationship with. And so basically, you might have a very close or almost a marriage-like relationship when you're young. Maybe you did get married in your 20s, then that broke apart. Then you found another marriage in your, I don't know, the late 20s or early 30s, and maybe that falls apart. And so you have a few or a little bit more than a few, both romantic and sexual relationships that are committed, and while you're with them, you're only with them. But if they when they fall apart, you just find somebody new, and that's what we call serial monogamy. Um, Also, today our people are much more likely to cohabit. You'll see the POSSLQ. You might think that's a new LGBT uh, uh, group, but it's not. This is just something that the government calls people who are not married but are living together. People of opposite sex sharing living quarters. We mostly call this cohabitation. That is, two people who are in a relationship and they're living together, but they're not married. This is very common nowadays. In the past, it wasn't. It was a taboo. Uh, if people cohabitated, your parents will like never tell anyone about it. It was very taboo. Today, it's almost a part of a normal relationship. Oftentimes, people will cohabit before they even think about getting married. Um, Now, why do people do this? Well, it's an alternative to living alone. Oftentimes, it's cheaper. Um, there are being married has a lot of like social and legal ties that sometimes people don't want to get into. Um, and some people believe that it will strengthen a marriage later on. They'll tell you things like, I wanted to get used to my partner before we decided to get married. And that is an excuse people give, but the data doesn't actually demonstrate that it helps. In fact, what we tend to find is that people who cohabit, actually, their marriage doesn't last as long. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this that uh, is it a commitment issue? Is it something about personal independence? Is it about low religiosity? What is the connection between cohabitation and divorce? Uh, my perspective is that people often expect that when you get married, things will change, right? And so, I don't know, you're in a relationship and maybe your girlfriend still's like going out a whole lot, or your boyfriend plays too many video games, and people go, oh, once we get married, then it'll be different, then it'll change. But of course, you get married and uh, the person doesn't change, because signing a piece of paper doesn't magically change someone. And when now you're married and the person that you're with is still acting, quote unquote, like you're not married, they're still doing the thing that annoyed you. And sometimes it's worse, because you're like, oh, now we're married, and now this really means that this person doesn't care about me or whatever. And then that leads to divorce. What is it? Is it that? Is it some other issue? All that we know for sure is that cohabitation tends to correlate with a higher likelihood of divorce. Now, obviously, sometimes people get married. Uh, this is the most common lifestyle among people 35 to around 44. Most people who, after they graduate, after you've established yourself, uh, people kind of feel like, oh, this is the next step. And so, especially if you already have a relationship, well, then marriage tends to be uh, the next step there. Especially in the past, marriage legitimized sexual relationships. Uh, More and more in our culture, we don't think of sexual relationships as having to be legitimized, right? It's my body. I can do with my body whatever I want, so long as it's with a consenting adult. Um, but in the past, it wasn't like that. In the past, sexuality was very taboo. And so marriage was how we kind of got around that. Marriage was how we said, oh, this sexual relationship is socially acceptable. Marriage also provides a social institution where we can have children and support our children and socialize our children. Again, our society, our modern society, because marriages fall apart so often that sometimes single parents have to raise kids, sometimes grandparents raise kids, sometimes there's other coming together of relationships. But in the past, and for most people, uh, marriages tend to be that child rearing institution. Also, in the past, when it was impossible to know whose child was whose, marriage allowed for that connection to be cemented. That is, if a child was born within a marriage, then you could be fairly certain that that child was the husband's child. Um, that's not always true, but at least legally it was. Okay. Also, a sense of security. Um, as you can see, most people tend to express that they are in a happy marriage, and men are often more likely than women to express that they are in a happy marriage. And so sometimes you ask a couple, how happy are you in a relationship? And the guy will be like, yeah, our relationship is great. And the woman will be like, no, there's real problems. Men tend to notice those issues less. And so men tend to be happier in marriages. It's also important to point out that in our culture, men resist marriage more than women. Women have this uh, desire to be part of a marriage, but it tends to be men who are happier in marriages. But as you can see, most people tend to say that they are happy in their marriage. I already talked about monogamy. Um, Again, monogamy is the idea that you are married to one person and only one person, um, and that's going to last essentially your entire life. Polygamy tends to occur when one spouse, usually the man, is permitted to marry multiple women. Sometimes when it's a woman and she is marrying multiple men, we call it polyandry. And that sounds like it's sort of a more feminist or more uh, equal kind of marriage, but it's not. In very few cultures, excuse me, uh, participate in polyandry. And when they do, it's really weird things. For example, in some parts of the world where there are way more men than women, one woman will marry, let's say, three brothers. And so she is married to three brothers who are related to each other. And it's no picnic for her. These aren't three men that she loves dearly. They are three men that she has sort of been almost forced to marry. So um, uh, there are more modern versions of polygamy. Sometimes you might have heard of the phrase polyamory, and that is a little bit more of an equal sort of playing field where one man or one woman, often one woman, will be married to multiple men whom she loves. And usually these men also love her a great deal, but that's very rare. It's not a very stable type of relationship where polygamy, at least in cultures that allow for polygamy, that's acceptable in that culture. And so that tends to be a little bit more stable. As I mentioned, in some cultures, there are arranged marriages where mom and dad will choose who you will marry. That is pretty old fashioned, even in cultures where it's common to have arranged marriages. It's just not done quite that way anymore. So the way most modern cultures, let's say a place like India, where uh, arranged marriages are still common, but in modern India, usually mom and dad will choose three, four men, and their daughter will meet these men, and she'll make the final choice between them. And so it's kind of like in the middle between arranged and a modern kind of choosing your own partner because you're romantically in love with them. Um, and then, of course, more and more, especially in the Western world, we see gay marriage. And of course, gay marriage is when two people of the same sex marry each other. And that was illegal for most of American history. Um, and it's only recently where that is not only legal, but common. And so you sort of expect that some of your gay friends or family members will eventually get married and have a life that is similar, or say a relationship that is similar to that of your straight friends and family. Ideal marriages, young people tend to marry people of similar neighborhood, again, so similar socially, similar economic background, often similar race and religion, but not everybody. Some people do marry outside of their race. Sometimes people marry outside of their socioeconomic class. But when you do, it is harder because different race, different socioeconomic background often means that there are cultural differences that you have to get used to. And it doesn't mean it can't work. Of course, it can work, and people can have very happy lives, and they do, but often it does take a little bit more effort. Um, Again, the idea of homogamy is the idea that you marry someone who is quite similar to you, similar in age, similar in ethnic background, similar in socioeconomic background. And one of the few studies that sort of focus on this very recently showed that the greater the age difference, the more likely that relationship is to end up finishing or that is ending up in divorce. Okay? Um, Marital satisfaction plays an important role in everything that you do, so that people who are married and they are happy together is going to affect your physical and psychological health positively. And when you are not happy, that's going to affect it negatively. That is, when you're happy, your health is better. When you're unhappy with your married life, your health is worse. There's strong connection between intimacy and trust and honesty and sharing your innermost feelings. That's going to help with a relationship. Oddly enough, relationships correlate with your career satisfaction, and it goes both ways. When you're not happy with your job, your relationship suffers. When you're not happy with your relationship, your career suffers. So these two things are very intertwined, and that makes perfect sense because your relationship is a big part of your life, and your job also a big part of your life. And so it makes sense that even though these two things are in different spheres, they often affect each other. And of course, marital satisfaction is going to decrease when there is physical aggression or when one of the partners drinks heavily. Um, right? Parenthood. Again, as I mentioned, most people delay parenthood until their 30s. And at least more and more people do it more and more. Even people who are married often want to spend their early part of their marriage kind of having fun and being together. And then they want to have kids when they're quote unquote more ready. And of course, people have children for a lot of different reasons happiness, well being, um, especially in traditional societies. People have children because they want to strengthen the marital bonds. They want to provide social security. That is, when you're older, you want someone to take care of you, especially in countries or cultures where there's still a lot of farm labor. You want a kid or a child to help you out in your labor and to provide social status. Uh, when you have kids, oftentimes you're seen as being more important than people who don't have kids. And even in our culture, where these sort of more traditional values don't really exist, they still kind of exist in the background. And so people will often kind of, tell you like, oh, your life doesn't even matter until you have kids. And you might say that's a ridiculous thing to say, but it's an emotion that a lot of people have because we've internalized it unconsciously. Another reason why people might have kids is to maintain the family lineage, to secure property rights, especially in cultures where I'm going to leave what I own to my children. That matters. Well, then obviously having children matters. If you read ancient Roman history, that was a really important part of being a wealthy Roman, was who were you going to leave all of your fortune to. Um, in some cultures, people believe that having kids improves the odds of reincarnation. And of course, I mentioned someone to take care of you in your old age. Role overload is something that mothers usually deal with because moms play multiple roles in their child's life and in other, through their life. So their mom, they are the breadwinner. They often also are, sisters and daughters and friends. And sometimes it's a lot, especially when you add mother. Mother is a big part and it takes a lot of effort. And so now mom is being split into 20 people. This doesn't often happen to men, or at least not as often. Number one, because it's more rare that men are single parents. Um, and when they are in a relationship, then often dad is like playmate to the kids, and they don't have to think of themselves as four different versions of themselves because in our culture, it's usually mom who takes on the bulk of caregiving. Postnatal adjustment, usually parents have to get used to having a kid in the house. When the both parents have shared beliefs, right? They both agree this is how we're going to raise our kids. That's going to be better for the relationship. Um, Especially who's going to do the bulk of the caretaking. Oftentimes, it's mom. If mom thinks that's what moms do, and dad thinks that's what moms do, even though a lot of pressure is being put on mom, that tends to be mostly okay because mom accepts this and dad accepts this. But when one of them doesn't, right? Either mom thinks you should be helping more, or dad wants to help and mom doesn't want him to help too much because that's just the way she sees those roles, that's going to affect the relationship. You want to talk to your partner about how are we going to raise these kids? What are your expectations and mine? Because oftentimes, if you're not on the same page, that will affect your relationship. Moms more and more, first of all, dual earner families are families that both mom and dad work. Um, Usually it's mom who has a hard time balancing their home life with their work life because it is expected that mom is going to do the bulk of the work at home. And of course, if she has a job, she still has to do her job. And on average, men can be kind of absent at home and focus more on their job. And so a lot of times that's the dual earner families is going to have more stress on mom. Divorce. Obviously, some people get divorced after they get married, and there's a lot of reasons for this. Adultery, that is, someone cheats in the relationship. Um, Women become more economic independent or have economic independence. And all of a sudden, especially if the relationship isn't very equal, the woman decides, why am I dealing with this? I don't have to be here. I can take care of myself. And that will lead to divorce. Um, Especially in cultures like ours where marriage is seen as alterable, like, hey, I don't have to be in a marriage if I don't want to. That allows for divorce. There are cultures, and America was a type of culture where people never got divorced. And in fact, you can find some older person in your life, especially in their 60s or older, and they're going to tell you that someone at some point told them, why are you going to get divorced? Stay with your husband even though he hits you. Stay with your husband even though he cheats on you. Because it was quite common for people to think of marriage as unalterable. But now that's not the case. Um, High expectations from marriage. Sometimes if your expectations of marriage are too high, you think people will change just because you married them, for example, then you're going to be let down. And when you're let down, you're not going to enjoy your marriage quite as much. Communication issues. A lot of people who get divorced say that the reason they got divorced is because they really didn't communicate with each other. Violence, infidelity, lack of commitment. There's a lot of reasons why people get divorced. Split marriages reduce standard of living for both parents. It affects moms more because all of a sudden you were making X amount of money together, and now that is being split in half. Again, because the way our culture works, there's a good chance that mom gets paid less than dad, and so mom just makes less money than dad. Also, often in our culture, the kids go live with mom. And so not only does mom make less money because of social issues, but now that money is lessened because she is taking care of the kids by themselves or by herself. When dad gives financial support, it's usually limited. Um, and a lot of times, men will leave and they don't take care of their kids at all. Um, again, fathers are supposed to pay alimony and child support at least for a certain amount of time, and obviously not all men do that. Okay. Divorces can also prompt fears of failure or feelings of failure, loneliness, etc. Okay. All right, guys. So in chapters 13 and 14, we talked about early adulthood, and I'm going to pause here. Um, uh, in the next chapter, we're going to talk about middle adulthood. But please make sure that you are working on chapters 13 and 14 activities and in your group project, which is due soon.